because your room is also your office, and business hours are whenever someone knocks, or barges in, or yells through the door. Yes, privacy is a modern concept. Here in Rome, walls are suggestions and doors are decorative. Most days begin with a quick clean-up of the room. Sweep out yesterday's dust, wine stains, and any lost sandals left behind by last night's visitors. Then comes the prep. Face powder, rouge, and enough perfume to qualify as flammable. You're not trying to smell good. You're trying to smell better than the guy in line behind you. You practice your best sultry half smile in the bronze mirror. Not because it works, but because pretending helps. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still riding the emotional high from that. Because here in the cellar, every day begins the same, cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough dignity to make it to lunchtime. After waking up in your glorified broom closet, it's time to prepare for another day of impressing clients and surviving public judgment. But first, hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. There is, of course, no private bathroom. That luxury is reserved for the wealthy, and even they just had pots with ambition. As a working girl in a city that worships marble statues but accepts open sewers, your best option is the nearest public fountain or bathhouse, depending on your mood and threshold for awkward nudity. If you're pressed for time, and let's face it, you usually are, you go for the quick rinse at the communal fountain. Splash some water on your face, rinse out your mouth with wine if you're fancy, and hope the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no soap, but maybe you've got a bit of natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates your skin and your self-esteem. If business is slow and coins are jangling in your little purse, you might splurge on a visit to the public baths, the great Roman equalizer. Everyone's there. Merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and that guy who talks too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You undress, store your belongings in a niche you trust way too easily, and wade into tepid water full of floating philosophical debates and someone else's toenail. Inside, you sweat in the steam room, scrape yourself with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and enjoy a brief moment of being the cleanest person in your street, a title that lasts about 5 minutes. After the bath, you dry off, apply more perfume, and try to remember if anyone's invented deodorant yet. They haven't. To finish the look, a bit of chalk-based face powder, a hint of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and kohl around the eyes. Not to highlight your beauty, to hide the fatigue. Clients don't want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a sailor before noon. They want mystery, allure, and someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. Now that you're washed, or at least convincingly perfumed, it's time to get dressed. And while Roman society had a lot of complicated opinions about fashion, there was one outfit that made things very clear: the female toga. Yes, toga. That flowing white garment we usually associate with senators, emperors, and frat parties. But here's the twist. In Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a political statement. She was making a professional one. It was a visual billboard for, "I'm not a respectable matron, and I am available for negotiation." Proper Roman women wore the stola, a long layered dress that said, "My husband controls my dowry, and I go to bed at 9. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were denied the stola by law and required to wear a toga, often short, brightly coloured, and intentionally flashy. Think less Grecian goddess, more visible from across the forum. The look was usually accessorized with cheap jewellery, bronze or glass beads, maybe some loud earrings. The goal wasn't elegance, it was visibility. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-metre radius, subtlety is a luxury you can't afford. Footwear? Likely simple sandals, maybe even barefoot depending on location and budget. Comfort wasn't a priority. You're going to spend a lot of the day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a bad client or an overzealous moralist. Hair was its own ordeal. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing wigs, especially blonde ones, imported from Gaul. Blonde hair had a certain exotic appeal in Rome, kind of like imported luxury soap, only more alive. And let's not forget the finishing touches. Makeup. Pale face powder to contrast with red lips and cheeks, and thick kohl eyeliner to make your eyes pop. Or at least look less sleep-deprived. Once fully dressed, you looked obvious. And that was the point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, scandalous, and economically available, then congratulations. You were ready for another glorious day of being judged by society while being actively funded by it. So you're dressed, painted, perfumed, and hopefully not too hungover. Now comes the fun part. Drumming up business in a city where everyone wants sex but pretends they're shocked when they find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or be immortalized in graffiti, preferably all three. Let's start with location strategy. If you worked out of a lupanar, brothel, your office was already built for visibility. Brothels were often located near bathhouses, markets, or drinking establishments. In short, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Think ancient foot traffic optimization. Standing in the doorway, wearing your finest look-at-me outfit, you'd call out to passers-by with a mixture of flattery, negotiation, and time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. Hey, might sound desperate, but hey, rent was due and the next girl over just dropped her rate to 1. If you were freelance, it was all about roaming visibility. You might hover near temples because nothing says divine inspiration like temptation, or hang around taverns, ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who still had some coin left and questionable judgment. But perhaps the most bizarre and weirdly effective form of Roman advertising. Wall graffiti. Yes, Pompeii has immortalized the genius of ancient street marketing. Brothel walls were plastered with handwritten reviews like, "Maritimus gave me the best time of my life," or "Felicia, 2 denarii, very fast service." These weren't just vandalism, they were ancient Yelp, unfiltered, unregulated, and very, very public. Some women even paid someone to write their name and specialty somewhere visible, usually near tavern entrances or on columns. Others let their clients do the writing, which, as you might expect, ranged from glowing praise to confused haikus about being robbed. All this made one thing clear. A prostitute's survival depended as much on marketing as on skill. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, someone else was getting the business. Because in ancient Rome, as now, the secret to success wasn't always talent. Sometimes it was just better PR. So you've advertised yourself. You've got the outfit, the eyeliner, and just enough confidence to fake a good mood. Now it's time to talk pricing, the part where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market while secretly judging you anyway. Let's be clear, there was no union. Rates were set by supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone bartered you down with a loaf of stale bread. For street-level workers, or those in lower-end lupanars, prices could be as low as 1 or 2 asses, a small bronze coin that wouldn't even get you a glass of wine. That's right, some clients were paying less than the cost of a decent lunch. If that feels depressing, remember, some women accepted food, sandals, or even promises as payment. Yes, in a city with an empire's worth of coinage, IOUs still existed. On the other hand, high-end prostitutes, often called meretrices, operated more like luxury brands. These women could charge in denarii, silver coins, sometimes multiple per client, especially if they had skills beyond the bedroom. Conversation, music, poetry, basic literacy. Anything that let a client believe they weren't just hiring company, but taste. Some prostitutes even had niches. Not architectural ones, marketing ones. Maybe you specialized in working with sailors, or performing erotic dances, or reciting poetry during the act. Don't laugh. Ovid probably inspired someone. The more unique your brand, the less replaceable you became. Repeat clients might get a discount, or not. It depended entirely on whether they paid on time or smelled like fermented cabbage. And if you worked under a pimp or brothel owner, a hefty cut of your earnings disappeared before you saw a single coin. Some women were enslaved, which meant they didn't get paid at all. Just food, shelter, and a vague promise that one day they might buy their freedom if they somehow won the Roman lottery. Welcome to the lupanar, the Roman brothel. It's not luxurious, but it has walls, which already makes it more dignified than working behind a tavern. Technically, it's a place of business. Realistically, it's a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. The term lupanar comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which the Romans used as slang for prostitute. That's right. Your job title was also your animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most lupanars were two-story buildings crammed between bathhouses and bars, perfect for catching foot traffic from half-drunk senators and bored sailors. Inside, you've got a narrow hallway lined with tiny rooms, each equipped with a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to reconsider your life choices. No doors, just curtains, for that open floor plan vibe. Privacy? That's something rich matrons had. You've got damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your shift wall. You're not alone, of course. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite known as the Leno, pimp, or Lena, madam. Their job was to take a cut of your earnings, promise repairs that never happened, and occasionally yell things like, "Work faster, he's important." Clients ranged from nervous teenagers to sweaty legionaries and balding senators claiming this was just a philosophical visit. Some were in and out faster than a dropped denarius. Others tried to talk about their poetry, which frankly was worse. During downtime, you'd sit near the entrance, giving your best "I'm flirty but dead inside" expression while calling out to passing foot traffic. Marketing was mostly volume-based. 2 coins! Special today! I'll pretend to listen. And yes, the walls were covered in graffiti, ancient Yelp reviews etched lovingly into the plaster. Felix was here, twice, or Thais gives a good time. Occasionally someone got artsy and drew pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate. Confidence, however, was never lacking. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. A roof over your head, a bed, if you squint, and if nothing else, you'd always have a front row seat to humanity's weirdest parade. Not every Roman prostitute worked in a lupanar. Some preferred, or were assigned to, the equally glamorous world of taverns. If the brothel was a chaotic office cubicle, the tavern was more like working in an open-air startup, with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns, kolpanai or popinai, were where Rome's finest drunkards, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and guys named Gaius with gambling debts gathered to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For prostitutes working here, the motto was simple: serve the wine, sell the charm, dodge the gropes. A typical shift involved pouring watered-down wine into dirty cups for people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. With your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the denarii flowing, but not so much that a brawl broke out. Unless that brawl was entertaining, in which case, carry on. Unlike the brothel, taverns were technically food establishments, so you had the delightful backdrop of boiled cabbage, fish sauce, and body odour. It was an aroma that clung to your tunic and your soul. But it also meant you could upsell a client. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't reek of garum. Some women worked the back rooms or upstairs areas, making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others kept things more casual, offering company, lap sitting, and heavily suggestive compliments like, "Your toga looks clean." This was high praise in Rome. Payment was often immediate. Credit did not exist. If a client tried to delay, you had options: yell, threaten, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye and a short temper. The upside: taverns offered more foot traffic and sometimes better tips. The downside: you were a waitress, therapist, and hostage negotiator all at once, and no one tipped for emotional labour. And of course, there was the endless soundtrack: shouting, dice clacking, lyre players trying to impress women, and the occasional argument over who invented democracy. Working tavern duty was unpredictable, exhausting, and smelled like despair. But it paid the bills. Sometimes, if the customers didn't vomit on your sandal first. For the entrepreneurial spirit with no brothel affiliation and too much confidence, there was always the street. Freelance prostitution in Rome meant walking the line between independent contractor and please don't arrest me. The Roman streets were alive with opportunity and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were called prostibuli, and they roamed the alleys, bathhouse entrances, marketplaces, and occasionally temple steps, because nothing says divine intervention like offering a discount outside a shrine to Venus. Daylight hours were decent for traffic but risky. You had to navigate gawking citizens, nosy magistrates, and angry matrons who thought your existence was ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler, it wasn't. You dressed brightly to stand out. Think short tunics, flashy jewellery, maybe a wig made from imported German hair. It was less understated elegance, more visible from across the Circus Maximus. The goal was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him. Approaching a potential customer involved a delicate dance of flirtation, timing, and not getting mistaken for someone's runaway slave. You'd smile, compliment his sandals, and casually mention your rate before the local vigils, street guards, decided your entrepreneurialism was public disorder. Some clients were polite, others were aggressively cheap, and a few were very confused and just wanted directions to the bathhouse. You learned quickly to tell them apart, mostly by the level of eye contact and how many coins they jingled. Competition was fierce. You weren't just up against fellow prostibuli, you were up against free lovers, drunken party girls, and retired gladiators with a side hustle. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no security, just your charm, your wits, and the ability to walk very fast in sandals. Some carried small knives or relied on nearby tavern bouncers. Others simply prayed that tonight's customers weren't philosophers with commitment issues. Still, for all its chaos, the street scene had its advantages. You set your own hours, kept your own profits, and didn't have to answer to a Leno breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat or philosophical heckler, but at least you were your own boss, in a city where bosses were rarely the good guys. If you thought the life of a Roman prostitute was already tough, allow us to introduce your least favourite client, the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire, brilliant engineers, conquerors of the Mediterranean, champions of togas, also invented a dedicated tax on prostitutes. It was called the Vectigal ex capturis, and it ensured that even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Congratulations, your nightly services just funded another aqueduct. The tax wasn't just unofficial pocket skimming either. This was a state-sanctioned system, managed by professional collectors known as publicani, men who were somehow both boring and terrifying. They kept detailed records, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while scribbling on their wax tablets. To legally operate, prostitutes had to register with the aediles, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector with an affinity for paperwork and moral superiority. Upon registration, you were entered into an official list of sex workers. Think of it as joining a trade union, except there were no benefits, and instead of a card, you got a branding, literally. Yes, some sex workers, especially enslaved ones, were branded or tattooed with marks like Looper or their owner's name. If you're wondering how that made clients feel, don't worry. The branding wasn't for them. It was to ensure you couldn't pretend to be respectable later. And the tax rate. It varied depending on location, class, and whether your clients were sad senators or discount gladiators. But it always stung. You paid per act or per week, depending on the region, and there was no deduction for emotional labour, uncomfortable silences, or existential dread. Refusing to pay could result in fines, arrest, or being barred from working, though enforcement was spotty, especially if you were paying under the table or knew how to flirt with an edile. Still, for a profession already swimming in stigma, this tax added insult to injury. Rome was essentially saying, "We disapprove of your lifestyle. Also, give us 10%. But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly say your labor was helping to fund another temple, probably dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't return your prayers. In Rome, being a prostitute meant you had legal permission to exist, and social permission to be endlessly judged. Yes, prostitution was tolerated by the law, taxed, regulated, even registered. But that didn't stop every senator, priest, and bored philosopher from telling you how much they disapproved of you, often while zipping up their tunic. Enter the moral police, not an official squad with batons, but a vast unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and writers who all believed it was their divine duty to shame you while enjoying the fruits of your labor behind closed doors. At the top of the hypocrisy food chain was the Roman Senate, a group of aging elites who believed in preserving Roman virtue, a concept they typically defined as whatever we're not caught doing. Many of them publicly railed against moral decay while maintaining discreet tabs at every brothel from the Forum to Subura. Then you had the aediles, Rome's actual public officials who enforced laws on cleanliness, order, and decency. Their job was to regulate brothels, inspect establishments, and sometimes fine women for being too obvious about their profession, which again was legally required to be obvious. You couldn't make it subtle if you tried. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca had a field day. They mocked prostitutes in verse, lumping them in with greedy merchants, loud women, and, horror of horrors, women who read books. And yet these same writers gave vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life. Almost as if they'd done extensive research. Even Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, got in on the judgment. They wouldn't speak to you, of course, but they'd walk past your street corner with a gaze that could sterilize a fig tree. Some even petitioned for laws banning prostitutes from wearing jewelry or entering public baths, which is rich considering many of their husbands treated bathhouse visits like part-time jobs. Working as a Roman prostitute came with certain occupational hazards, namely disease, injury, and whatever that thing was the sailor from Brundisium left behind. Welcome to the health and wellness chapter, where the only prescription is, hope you survive. Let's begin with the big one, venereal disease. Ancient Rome didn't have germ theory, but they did know that some men left you with more than a coin purse and a bad poem. There are Roman texts that describe symptoms ranging from persistent itching to things falling off that shouldn't. The medical advice? Usually a mix of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. Pregnancy was another ever-present concern. There was no birth control pill, but there were options if you had the guts and the budget. Prostitutes used natural contraceptives like silphium, an extinct plant famously over-harvested for this exact reason. Animal intestines as crude condoms, and wool tampons soaked in herbal concoctions. Effectiveness? Somewhere between maybe and miracle. If pregnancy occurred, things got complicated. Some women carried to term and raised their children, often within the brothel itself. Others gave infants up to foundling homes, or worse, the open streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but turning a blind eye, that was practically a civic duty. For day-to-day ailments, sore muscles, cuts, stress-induced rage blackouts. The go-to remedy was usually wine, opium, or a slap from your leaner to stop whining. If that failed, you might visit a temple of Asclepius and sleep on the floor hoping for a healing dream. Ancient wellness culture was less spa weekend and more mystical nap with side effects. Infections were common. Hygiene was ambitious. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, and absolutely no one washing their hands before sticking fingers where fingers had no business being. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Depression, trauma, anxiety, all part of the job. Rome didn't have therapists. You had fellow prostitutes, wine, and the occasional stray cat who listened without judgment. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, prostitutes weren't just dodging moral judgment. They were also trying to stay on the gods' good side, or at least bribe them for health, luck, and a low-maintenance clientele. Religion in Rome was a full-time job, and the gods were always watching, judging, occasionally cursing. But the divine pantheon had a few deities who were, let's say, more lenient toward your profession. First there was Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and general poor decision-making. Many prostitutes dedicated small altars to her in their rooms. Offerings of flowers, perfume, or a coin were made in hopes of attracting wealth, charm, or at the very least, clients who didn't smell like boiled goat. Then came Fortuna, goddess of luck. Given how random your daily income was, ranging from a gold bracelet to 3 mouldy grapes and a promise, Fortuna was kind of a big deal. You might wear a charm bearing her likeness or mumble a quick prayer before a customer with too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals walked in. But religion wasn't all glitter and flirtation. The darker side of belief included superstition, omens, and magical countermeasures, because when in doubt, blame the spirits. You'd burn incense to ward off the evil eye, tie red cords around your ankle for protection, or hire a professional witch to curse a rival prostitute's hairline. Don't laugh. Curse tablets, called defixiones, have been found all over Roman brothel districts, many reading like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot. May her clients dry up. May she trip in the street and land in donkey dung. If you were enslaved, you might also pray to Mercury, the god of commerce and transactions, because let's be honest, your life was one long receipt. And if you were lucky enough to save up for freedom, Libertas, the goddess of liberty, got a private altar and a slightly more expensive candle. All this spiritual effort wasn't just tradition, it was survival with flair. When Rome gave you judgment, disease, and rude senators, the gods were your HR department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always accepting offerings. Love, in the Roman world of prostitution, was complicated. At best, it was a pleasant delusion, and at worst, a financial liability in a tunic. Clients fell in love all the time, or claimed they did, usually after 3 cups of wine and half a monologue about their mother. Some were sincere, some were drunk, and some were trying to get a discount. "But baby, I'm different," they'd say, clutching your hand like a tragic poet. And you'd nod politely, mentally calculating how much they still owed you. Some working women reciprocated these feelings, or at least pretended to. Emotional labor was part of the package. Smile, listen, pretend his toga doesn't smell like despair. For a few clients, you might even develop something real: attachment, affection, or just mutual exhaustion. But more often than not, romance was a dangerous distraction, especially when you remembered that Rome legally categorized you as infames, meaning you could not legally marry a citizen even if you wanted to. That didn't stop people from trying. There are tales of prostitutes who fell in love with their regulars, who were promised freedom, marriage, a house with a garden, only to end up abandoned the moment another woman with better eyeliner walked by. There were also clients who genuinely adored their favourite companion, showering them with gifts, poems, and occasionally actual manumission. the legal act of freeing a slave. These stories exist, but they were the exception, not the rule. Among fellow prostitutes, real bonds were more likely. You worked side by side, endured the same insults, shared the same lice. Some of these friendships became sisterhoods. Others became quiet romantic partnerships hidden beneath the radar of Roman patriarchy, which believed women couldn't fall in love with anyone except a man with a sword collection. And of course, there were lies you told yourself. That one day you'd quit, that your best client really would take you away, that if you could just save a little more, you'd open a perfume shop in Ostia and never look back. Maybe it wasn't true, but in Rome, everyone had a fantasy. Yours just came with better lighting and lower expectations. In the Roman world of sex work, beauty was currency, and youth was the exchange rate. So what happened when the blush wore off? The client stopped lingering, and your joint started popping louder than your earrings. Simple. You aged out, but you didn't disappear. Some women, having saved carefully, or miraculously had a client with both money and follow-through, managed to buy their freedom if they were enslaved and start over. The luckiest opened taverns or bathhouses, renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others became madams, line, the brothel version of upper management. Less action, more shouting. As a Lena, you didn't need to be young or pretty. You needed to be sharp, intimidating, and fluent in threats involving sandals and overdue debts. You ran the schedules, kept the books, and made sure the curtains were only mildly horrifying. Clients feared you. Workers pretended to respect you. The Edels sighed when they saw you coming. Other retired sex workers leaned into fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake walk through the door, predicting doom becomes second nature. A few became unofficial therapists, wise women, or herbalists, offering advice laced with sarcasm and slightly incorrect medical suggestions. But many simply kept working because Rome wasn't in the habit of offering pensions to women who'd spent 2 decades in a toga. Older prostitutes still had clients, they just adjusted their marketing. Less blushing flower, more experienced, discreet, and tolerates poetry. Physical appearance mattered, but so did reputation. A woman known for conversation, kindness, or mind-blowing. Astrology readings could remain in demand long after her prime. And for those with no savings, no patrons, and no lucky breaks, the options weren't kind. You begged, you cleaned temples, you worked in laundries until your hands turned into shriveled olives. Rome didn't care how you got old, only that you did so quietly. But here's the truth they didn't carve into marble. For many, survival itself was the achievement. And if you made it to old age with your wit intact and at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. When people think of ancient Rome, they picture marble statues, grand speeches, and emperors with questionable family trees. What they rarely picture: the woman leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig, and mentally calculating how many coins she needs to not starve next week. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in the shadows. They've been kept there by history, carefully edited out of the noble narrative so school children could learn about aqueducts without asking uncomfortable questions. Yet they were everywhere. In graffiti, legal records, satire, poems, love letters, curse tablets, and receipts. Yes, actual receipts. They were a fixture of daily Roman life, even as society treated them like morally contagious wallpaper. What history usually gets wrong is the assumption that these women were powerless victims or morally bankrupt seductresses. In reality, many were savvy, adaptable, and, dare we say, better at business than half the Senate. They knew how to read a client, negotiate terms, avoid danger, and hustle a living in a city that cheered gladiators and stoned anyone who wore the wrong shoes. And they weren't all the same. Some were enslaved, some free. Some catered to the wealthy, others to whoever had 2 coins and bad breath. Some hated every second, Others carved out small corners of power and routine. Most existed somewhere in between, like everyone else in Rome, pretending they weren't tired. Their stories were rarely written by them. Instead, they were remembered by poets looking for metaphors, by moralists clutching their pearls, or by archaeologists piecing together Pompeii's raciest wall scribbles. But here's what's remarkable. They're still visible. In stone carvings, in sarcastic graffiti, in laws and loopholes and offhand mentions in love poems. These women were erased from respectability, but not from reality. They worked, they laughed, they scammed, they wept, and they endured. All without marble statues or gilded tombs, just faint ink on a crumbling wall. Maritima was here, and worth every coin. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of Rome, remember, behind every toga-clad philosopher was a working girl keeping the economy and the gossip alive. In the world of the Vikings, warfare was a constant presence, and with it came injuries, deep cuts from swords, axe wounds, broken bones, and burns from fire and frost. On the battlefield or back in the village, it was the leknir, the healer, who was called upon to treat the wounded. These individuals were respected members of society, combining the practical knowledge of herbs with the spiritual traditions of Norse belief. Among the most trusted herbs in a Viking healer's collection was yarrow, Achillea millefolium. Known for its ability to staunch bleeding, yarrow was used widely across northern Europe. Viking healers would crush the leaves and apply them directly to wounds, either alone or mixed into a poultice. Yarrow acted as a coagulant, helping to stop blood flow and prevent infection. It was believed to possess sacred properties, with legends connecting its power to Odin himself. The preparation of such remedies was both methodical and rooted in cultural ritual. The healer might wash the wound with boiled water infused with antiseptic herbs, apply crushed yarrow, and bind the area tightly with linen or animal skin strips. In some cases, chants or prayers were recited during the process, invoking protection or healing from the gods. Healing was not just physical, it was also spiritual. Beyond battlefield wounds, yarrow was used internally as well. A tea made from its flowers and leaves could reduce fevers, ease digestive complaints, or help relieve menstrual cramps. It was a versatile plant, and one that could be found growing throughout the Viking homelands, in fields, near rivers, or in small garden plots maintained by women of the household. Healers in Viking society had a deep understanding of their environment. They knew which plants grew in which seasons, how to harvest them properly, and how to preserve them for use during the long, dark winters. Knowledge was passed down through generations, often from mother to daughter, or from elder to apprentice. These traditions blended elements of Germanic herbal lore with the rich cosmology of Norse mythology. In a world without hospitals or modern antibiotics, the skill of the healer and the power of plants like yarrow were essential to survival and to maintaining strength in a warrior-driven culture. While yarrow addressed bleeding and surface wounds, the Viking healers' battle against infection required deeper remedies. One of the most revered herbs in this regard was Angelica, Angelica archangelica, a tall aromatic plant with hollow stalks and umbrella-shaped clusters of greenish-white flowers. It thrived in the cold climates of Scandinavia and was considered so valuable that it was cultivated in monastery gardens long after the Viking Age ended. Angelica held a central place in early northern European medicine, prized for its broad-spectrum medicinal properties. Viking healers used the root, leaves and seeds to prepare a variety of treatments. Most commonly, the root was dried and then steeped into decoctions to fight internal infections. It was known for its warming effect on the body and was used to stimulate circulation, cleanse the blood, and reduce inflammation. The antiseptic properties of Angelica were vital in treating infected wounds, especially those that had been neglected or exposed to dirt and decay. A healer might grind the root and mix it with animal fat or beeswax to create a salve, then apply it to festering injuries. When ingested as a tea or tincture, Angelica helped combat respiratory infections, fevers and digestive issues, ailments that could become life-threatening in a time without antibiotics. But Angelica's power extended beyond physical healing. In Norse cosmology, certain plants were believed to carry divine energy. The name Angelica itself, though Latin in origin, echoes the spiritual reverence surrounding the plant. In Christianized Europe, it was said to have been revealed by an angel to cure the plague. While Viking belief systems were different, they too held that some plants were gifts from the gods. It is likely that Angelica, with its strong scent and dramatic appearance, was associated with protection and sacred power. Women, who often served as herbalists within the household, used Angelica to treat gynecological conditions. It was thought to regulate menstrual cycles and ease childbirth, a dangerous and sacred moment in Norse society. Because of its reputation as a purifier, Angelica was also used in smoke rituals to cleanse homes and ward off disease during times of illness. In every Viking community, from remote farms to coastal trading towns, Angelica was a cornerstone of natural medicine. Its effectiveness and symbolic weight made it a trusted ally in the healer's quest to preserve life in a harsh and unpredictable world. As spring arrived in the Viking world, it brought with it one of the most vital remedies for fever and fatigue: birch sap. The birch tree, widespread across Scandinavia, was more than just a source of wood. It was a living pharmacy. Vikings tapped the tree in early spring, collecting the clear, slightly sweet sap as it rose from the roots to nourish new leaves. This seasonal practice required skill and timing, as the sap could only be harvested for a short period before the tree fully awakened. Healers used birch sap as a tonic for those weakened by long winters, illness, or lingering fevers. It was served fresh or fermented into a lightly alcoholic drink known for its revitalizing qualities. Rich in minerals, electrolytes, and natural sugars, birch sap helped rehydrate the body and restore lost energy, especially after the depletion caused by sickness or extended fasting. In an era without formal nutrition science, Viking healers recognized the restorative power of this gift from nature. In cases of fever, healers often paired birch sap with infusions of cooling herbs such as meadowsweet or elderflower. This gentle combination helped bring down body temperature while nourishing the patient. In more serious cases, the sap might be mixed with bitter herbs like wormwood to purge the body of what was believed to be harmful humours. The logic was simple: cleanse, restore, and rebalance. Beyond its internal uses, the birch tree had a role in external treatments too. The bark, when boiled, produced a tar-like substance with antiseptic properties. It was used to treat skin infections, minor burns, and bites. Birch leaves were also used in poultices and steam baths to draw out toxins from the body, often accompanied by prayer or ritual to align the physical with the spiritual. Symbolically, the birch tree represented renewal and purity. It was often the first tree to grow after land was cleared or burned, and this regenerative quality made it sacred in both Germanic and Norse traditions. The use of its sap in healing reflected this belief, returning vitality to the sick and offering the promise of recovery after hardship. In the healer's practice, birch sap was a seasonal treasure, a clear, life-giving elixir that marked the changing of the year and the persistence of health in a cold and often merciless land. In Viking herbal medicine, juniper was revered for its powerful cleansing properties, both physical and spiritual. Growing abundantly in the rocky soils of Scandinavia, juniper bushes with their prickly needles and aromatic berries were among the most trusted tools in a healer's repertoire. Whether burned, boiled, or brewed, juniper was used to purify the body, the air, and even the spirit. Juniper berries were commonly used as a diuretic and a remedy for urinary tract infections. When consumed as a tea or decoction, they stimulated kidney function, helping the body to flush out excess water and harmful substances. This made them especially useful during illnesses that involved swelling, bloating, or lingering fevers. The berries also had mild antiseptic properties, allowing them to address infections from within, a crucial function in an age with no antibiotics. For respiratory issues, juniper smoke played a vital role. Healers would burn dried juniper branches and let the smoke fill a room or a tent, believing it could drive out disease. This wasn't just symbolic. The antimicrobial compounds in juniper smoke helped disinfect the air. During outbreaks of sickness or after a death, Viking homes and ships might be cleansed in this way. The practice was both practical and spiritual, banishing what could be seen and what could not. In steam baths and sweat lodges, a tradition shared across many northern European cultures, juniper branches were sometimes laid on the hot stones or added to the water. As the vapor rose, it carried the sharp, invigorating scent of the plant, opening the lungs and inducing heavy sweating. This was thought to cleanse the body of toxins and the soul of imbalance, reconnecting a person with the rhythms of nature and health. Juniper also held ritual importance. Branches might be hung over doorways to ward off evil, or carried in small bundles by travelers for protection. Its strong, earthy fragrance symbolized resilience, and its presence in healing was a reminder that purification was as much about the unseen forces as it was about physical ailments. For Viking healers, juniper was not merely a remedy, it was a symbol of renewal and defense, a guardian plant that stood between the fragile human body and the chaotic forces of the world. Its sharp needles and potent berries helped them keep sickness at bay, one breath of smoke or sip of tea at a time. Among the many herbs known to Viking healers, meadowsweet, Filipendula ulmaria, was particularly valued for its ability to ease pain and reduce inflammation. Found in damp meadows and along riverbanks, this fragrant plant with creamy white flowers was a staple in early Germanic and Norse herbal medicine. Though they lacked modern terminology, Viking healers recognized that some plants had the power to cool fevers, relieve discomfort, and help the body recover more gently. Meadowsweet was often used to treat headaches, joint pain, and digestive problems. The flowers and leaves were dried and steeped into teas, which were given to patients suffering from fevers or general aches, common complaints in a harsh climate where physical labor and exposure were part of daily life. The herb's soothing effects made it an essential remedy during times of illness and recovery. Unbeknownst to the Vikings, meadowsweet contains compounds similar to salicylic acid, the basis for modern aspirin. This natural pain-relieving ability explains why it was so effective and frequently used. Healers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Less fever, reduced swelling, and relief from discomfort. These benefits were especially important during the winter months when colds, joint pain, and respiratory infections were widespread. For digestive issues, meadowsweet was considered a gentle treatment for nausea, heartburn, and stomach cramps. Its calming properties helped settle the stomach, and it was sometimes combined with other herbs like chamomile or mint if available, to create a broader treatment. The plant's sweet scent also made it a comforting addition to healing rituals, which often blended the sensory with the medicinal. Meadowsweet's role wasn't limited to physical healing. Its delicate, almost ethereal presence tied it to the natural cycles of growth and decay, life and death. As with many Viking remedies, its use may have included symbolic gestures, such as laying its flowers near the ill, or including it in burial rites to ease the journey to the afterlife. Some sagas and later folk traditions refer to sweet-smelling herbs as gifts from the gods or spirits of the land. In a culture that respected strength, but understood the necessity of healing, meadowsweet was a quiet, yet powerful ally. It helped warriors rest, allowed children to recover, and gave the elderly comfort in their final years. For the healer, it was one of the gentlest and most reliable tools in their care. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, held a special place in the Viking healer's practice, not only as a medicinal herb, but also as a spiritual tool. Known across northern Europe for its bitter aroma and silvery leaves, mugwort was considered one of the most sacred plants in Germanic tradition. For Viking societies, where healing was never just physical, mugwort served as a bridge between the body, the mind and the unseen world. Medicinally, mugwort was used to treat a wide range of ailments. It helped with digestive problems, menstrual irregularities, and fatigue. A tea made from its leaves was used to ease stomach cramps, stimulate appetite, and support the liver. Viking women in particular relied on mugwort to regulate their cycles and aid with childbirth. In a world without midwives or formal obstetrics, the healer's knowledge of such herbs was vital for survival during pregnancy and delivery. Mugwort also had powerful nervine properties, meaning it calmed the nervous system. For warriors who experienced restlessness or nightmares, mugwort tea or smoke was thought to restore inner balance and protect the mind. Sleep, which was often disturbed after battle or illness, could be coaxed back by burning dried mugwort near the bedside or placing it under the pillow. This wasn't simply superstition. Many aromatic herbs do have mild sedative effects, but beyond its medicinal uses, mugwort was strongly linked to ritual and magic. Viking healers and wise women, often referred to as volur or seidkunur, used mugwort in ceremonies to invoke dreams, protection, or visions. It was sometimes burned during rites of cider, the Norse form of trance magic and prophecy. The rising smoke was believed to carry prayers to the gods or ward off harmful spirits. Healers might also use mugwort during solstice ceremonies, seasonal changes, or in times of emotional distress. A bundle of mugwort could be hung over the door for protection, carried in a pouch during travel, or placed on the body during healing rituals. Its bitter scent and strong energy made it a plant of thresholds, used when the body or soul was in transition. To the Viking healer, mugwort was more than a plant. It was an ancient ally, one that stood at the intersection of medicine and magic, guiding the sick not only toward physical recovery, but toward spiritual realignment with the world and the gods. Among the most practical and powerful remedies in the Viking healer's collection was garlic, Allium sativum. Though not native to Scandinavia, garlic had long been traded across Europe and may have reached the Viking world through early contact with the British Isles, Frankish territories, and Eastern markets. Its strong scent and potent medicinal qualities made it an essential part of early Norse medicine, especially for infections, parasites, and protection against disease. Garlic's antibacterial and antifungal properties were well known, even if not scientifically understood. Viking healers used crushed garlic in poultices to clean wounds and prevent festering, particularly important for injuries sustained during battle or travel. When applied directly to cuts, garlic could kill harmful microbes and reduce inflammation. Though painful, this treatment was effective in preventing deeper infections in a time when even minor wounds could turn deadly. Internally, garlic was often eaten raw, pounded into pastes, or brewed into strong infusions. It was believed to strengthen the immune system, purify the blood, and warm the body during illness. In harsh northern winters, when colds, fevers, and coughs were widespread, garlic served as a valuable tonic. It was sometimes combined with honey, another antimicrobial agent, to make the strong flavour more palatable and to enhance its healing effect. Garlic was also used to treat parasites, especially intestinal worms, which were common due to poor sanitation and frequent contact with livestock. A mixture of garlic and vinegar was administered in small doses to purge the body. Its pungent nature made it a strong cleansing agent, and its association with vitality gave it symbolic weight in Norse healing traditions. Beyond the body, garlic was believed to repel evil spirits and malevolent forces. Healers or household members might hang braided garlic near doorways or in sleeping areas, not just to ward off disease, but to protect from unseen dangers, especially during times of illness, war, or childbirth. It served both as a physical remedy and a spiritual safeguard. For Viking warriors, garlic was not only a cure, but a form of daily defense. Before raids or journeys, some are believed to have consumed it as part of preparation, viewing its strength and fire as a shield within the body. In this way, garlic stood as a symbol of endurance, fighting infection, energizing the weak and anchoring the body in a dangerous, ever-changing world. In the Viking Age, the stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, was more than a nuisance. It was a plant of power. Despite its painful sting, nettle was one of the most useful and respected herbs in Norse healing traditions. It grew abundantly in meadows, forest edges, and near settlements, making it easily accessible to healers and households alike. Its medicinal benefits were numerous, and its resilience in harsh conditions mirrored the strength and endurance the Vikings valued. Nettle was used primarily to treat conditions related to blood and vitality. Viking healers prepared nettle teas or broths to combat fatigue, iron deficiency, and overall weakness. Rich in iron, calcium, and vitamin C, nettle acted as a natural tonic, especially important during long winters when fresh food was scarce and illness spread easily. Warriors recovering from battle or children recovering from fever were often given nettle to rebuild strength. The leaves were dried or cooked to reduce their sting and then brewed into infusions. These drinks were believed to purify the blood, promote circulation, and encourage the body to rid itself of harmful substances. Nettle also had a mild diuretic effect, making it useful for treating fluid retention and joint pain, common issues among labourers and older community members. In external treatments, nettle was sometimes used in surprising ways. The practice of urtication, striking sore limbs with fresh nettle stalks, was used to stimulate circulation and relieve arthritis or muscle stiffness. Though painful, it was believed to bring warmth and life back to cold or stiff areas of the body. This method, though unusual by modern standards, was rooted in generations of observation and belief in the plant's invigorating properties. Nettle also served practical roles beyond medicine. Its fibers were used to make rope, fishing nets, and even cloth, especially during times when flax or wool were scarce. This dual utility, nourishing the body and supporting daily life, made nettle a deeply integrated part of Viking culture. Symbolically, nettle was a plant of resilience. It thrived in disturbed soil and returned year after year, no matter how often it was cut back. In Norse society, where survival required both strength and adaptation, nettle embodied those values. For the healer, it was a reminder that even the most painful plants could bring healing, and that power often came from what first seemed harmful. Viking herbal medicine was never written down in formal texts during the age itself. Instead, it lived in the spoken word, in chants passed from mother to daughter, in gestures shared among wise women, and in the quiet work of healers who blended tradition, observation, and belief. These practices formed a body of knowledge deeply rooted in both the natural environment and Norse cosmology. To treat illness in the Viking world was not just to cure the body, but to restore balance to the person, the household, and the invisible threads connecting them to the gods. Healers in Viking society worked with what the land provided. They knew which herbs to gather in spring, which roots to dry in autumn, and how to preserve medicinal plants through the long winter months. Yarrow, angelica, birch, juniper, meadowsweet, mugwort, garlic, and nettle. Each had a specific role, but all were part of a larger system of understanding the body in harmony with nature. Treatments were physical, yes, but also symbolic. Illness might be seen as a disturbance in fate, a challenge from the gods, or an imbalance between the seen and unseen worlds. Women played a central role in maintaining and passing down this knowledge. In longhouses and farmsteads, female healers oversaw the care of families and communities. Some took on more specialized roles, like the volur, seers who blended healing with prophecy, often called upon during crises. Their work often included sacred herbs, spiritual rituals, and appeals to divine forces like Frigg, Air, or Freya. Healing was not just a duty, it was an act of connection between mortal life and the mythic world. With the spread of Christianity and the decline of Norse paganism, much of this oral tradition faded or was absorbed into new religious frameworks. Monasteries adopted and preserved some of the herbs and techniques, while others disappeared or became entangled in superstition and fear. But echoes of Viking herbal medicine can still be found today, in Scandinavian folk healing, in modern herbalism, and in the renewed interest in ancestral plant knowledge. The legacy of Viking healers lies not just in the herbs they used, but in the worldview they preserved, that nature holds power, that healing is both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom often resides in the hands of those who listen to the land. Joan of Arc was born in the winter of 1412 in the rural village of Domremy, a quiet hamlet in northeastern France, nestled near the border of Burgundy. At the time, France was fractured by war and civil unrest. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already dragged on for decades, and northern France was caught in the crossfire. Joan was born into this turbulence, the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, devout peasants who raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. Her family lived modestly. They owned a small patch of land, a few animals, and relied on farming to survive. Joan was not taught to read or write, like most girls of her class, but she was known for her hard work and deep religious devotion from an early age. She spent much of her childhood helping around the house, tending sheep and attending church. Her world was humble and steeped in faith. The voices she would later claim to hear would come to someone who already spent hours in prayer and contemplation. Domremy itself was a contested area. Though technically loyal to the French crown, it bordered Burgundian territory, a faction allied with the English. The threat of violence was constant. Raids by Anglo-Burgundian forces occasionally swept through the region, destroying crops and burning homes. Joan would have grown up with stories of heroism and defeat, of saints and warriors, of kings and traitors. Her early years were shaped by instability, fear, and a longing for peace. Despite the fear that hung over France, Joan's childhood was not without community. She was well liked in the village and described by neighbours as kind, pious, and unusually serious for her age. She often prayed at a nearby chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, where she would later claim her divine mission began. These years laid the spiritual and emotional foundation for what would come. Her faith, her loyalty to the king, and her sense of purpose were not formed in the royal court, but in the fields and chapels of her village. From such humble origins, no one could have imagined that this peasant girl, illiterate, unknown, and barely a teenager, would one day stand before kings, lead armies, and challenge the might of empires. At the age of 13, Joan of Arc's life changed forever. She later testified that in the summer of 1425, while alone in her father's garden, she experienced a vision, accompanied by a voice that seemed to come from beyond this world. At first, she was afraid. The voice, surrounded by a dazzling light, was accompanied by the appearance of figures she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, three powerful saints in Catholic tradition. These visions would continue, growing in intensity and clarity over time. The message was clear but extraordinary. She was chosen by God to help save France. More specifically, her divine mission was to drive the English out of French territory and to ensure the coronation of Charles, the Dauphin, as the rightful king of France. It was a staggering revelation for a young peasant girl with no military experience, no formal education, and no standing in society. Joan told no one at first. She kept the visions private, fearing disbelief or punishment. But the voices persisted, urging her to act. Over the next few years, she became increasingly convinced that her mission was real. She began to devote herself even more deeply to prayer, fasting, and religious discipline, believing that her purity and obedience were essential for fulfilling God's will. By 1428, the political and military situation in France had worsened. The English had captured much of northern France, and the city of Orléans, a key stronghold, was under siege. The Dauphin Charles remained uncrowned, his legitimacy in question. Joan, now 16, believed the time had come to act. She travelled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and requested an audience with the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, claiming she had a message for the king. At first, Baudricourt and his men laughed her off. The teenage girl claiming divine guidance was hardly taken seriously. But Joan was persistent. She returned again and again, speaking with a conviction that unsettled some and impressed others. Eventually, after hearing reports of her reputation for piety and learning that she had predicted a military setback in Orléans before news had reached the town, Baudricourt relented. He agreed to send her, dressed in men's clothing and under armed escort, to meet the Dauphin. Joan's journey from peasant child to military envoy had begun, led by visions, faith, and an unshakable sense of destiny. In early 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, where Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, held his court. The journey had been long and dangerous. She travelled more than 300 miles through enemy territory, dressed as a man to avoid attention and assault. When she finally stood before the royal court, she was met with skepticism and curiosity. Charles, unsure of her motives and wary of trickery, decided to test her. To begin, he disguised himself in plain clothes and hid among his courtiers. Joan, having never seen him before, immediately picked him out and addressed him directly. Witnesses were astonished. She reportedly told him details that only he and his closest advisors would have known, possibly regarding a private prayer or secret doubt. For many in the court, it was the first sign that something beyond explanation was at work. Still, Charles was cautious. He ordered that Joan be examined by theologians and church officials in Poitiers. For several weeks she was questioned about her visions, her morality, and her doctrine. She was a teenage girl being grilled by learned men, yet she answered with composure and confidence. Her virginity was tested, as it was believed her purity was essential for her divine mission. The examiners found nothing heretical in her claims and noted her remarkable character and intelligence, despite her lack of formal education. The court's advisors concluded she could be sent to Orléans with the army. But first, Joan requested something symbolic, something that would signal her role not merely as a soldier, but as a divine emissary. She asked for a banner. The banner she received was white, embroidered with an image of Christ and the words Jesus Maria. It would become her most treasured possession, and she carried it into every battle, declaring that she preferred the banner to the sword. She was also fitted with a custom suit of white armour and given a sword, which she claimed to have been divinely led to discover behind the altar of a chapel in Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. With her armour, banner, and a company of soldiers, Joan prepared to march toward Orléans. She was just 17 years old, young, untrained, and utterly convinced that God had sent her to save France. Her arrival at the besieged city would mark the beginning of one of the most legendary military campaigns in European history. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orléans had been under siege by the English for several months. Its fall would have opened the way to the heart of France, and with it, likely the collapse of French resistance. Morale was low, supplies were dwindling, and the Dauphin's cause teetered on the edge of defeat. Then Joan of Arc arrived. She entered the city on April 29th, met by cheering crowds who believed her to be a miracle sent by God. Clad in white armour and riding a white horse, she quickly became a symbol of hope and divine favour. Her presence reinvigorated the French troops and citizens alike. Though she had no formal military training, Joan spoke with boldness and authority, urging immediate action against the English fortifications. French commanders, initially hesitant to take orders from a teenage peasant girl, soon found themselves drawn to her conviction. Joan urged an aggressive strategy, claiming her voices had promised victory. Despite her youth, she rode into battle beside the soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions. Her courage on the field inspired others to fight with renewed determination. Over the course of a week, the French launched a series of offensives to break the siege. Joan wielded not just her sword but her banner, rallying the troops with cries of faith and purpose. She was wounded during the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, shot in the shoulder by an arrow. Refusing to retreat, she returned to the field after having the wound dressed, continuing to urge the men forward. On May 8th, the English finally lifted the siege and withdrew. It was a stunning victory, one that changed the momentum of the war. For the first time in years, the French had dealt a decisive blow to English forces. Joan's role was undeniable. Her leadership, her fearlessness, and her spiritual authority had turned the tide. The victory at Orléans was more than a military achievement. It was a turning point in the national consciousness of France. The peasant girl from Domremy had fulfilled the first part of her divine mission. Now, she turned her focus toward her second goal: to see the Dauphin crowned as king at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. The road to legitimacy had begun. With the siege of Orléans lifted, Joan of Arc's mission shifted toward a far more symbolic objective: the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her visions, this was not merely a political event, it was a divine command. Charles needed to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed with sacred oil. But Reims was deep in territory controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. To reach it, Joan and the French army would have to march through hostile lands. Despite the risk, Joan was adamant. Her belief that God had cleared the path gave her confidence, and her conviction began to influence even the cautious Charles. After several victories along the Loire Valley, including battles at Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency, momentum was on their side. The army gained strength as towns submitted and morale surged. By July 1429, Joan and the royal court set out on what would later be called the coronation journey. Along the way, cities and castles opened their gates without resistance. Word of Joan's miraculous success had spread. Many believed that to resist her was to resist divine will. Her presence in the army, young, determined, and riding under her white banner, created an aura of invincibility. On July 16th, the French forces reached Reims. The city's leaders, after some hesitation, surrendered peacefully. The next day, inside the Cathedral of Reims, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner high. For her, it was the fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her voices. The coronation was a moment of triumph, both for the new king and for Joan. From an obscure village, she had risen to command armies and to place a crown on a monarch's head. The people saw her not just as a heroine, but as a chosen messenger of God. Her presence had transformed the war from a political struggle into a spiritual cause. But success brought tension. With Charles now crowned, some at court questioned Joan's continued influence. Politics returned to the forefront. Joan had completed the task she was called to, but she was not finished. Her next desire was to press forward, to reclaim Paris. Yet the support she once commanded so easily was beginning to waver. After the coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc pushed for a bold new objective: the liberation of Paris, still under English and Burgundian control. For Joan, reclaiming the French capital was not just a political necessity. It was part of her divine mission to fully restore France to its rightful king. But not everyone shared her urgency. King Charles VII, newly crowned and politically cautious, hesitated. His advisors urged diplomacy, favouring a negotiated truce with the Burgundians. But Joan remained resolute. She believed that delay would only strengthen the enemy, and that God had already cleared the way for victory. Eventually, Charles agreed to an assault on Paris, though without full commitment. He provided limited troops and delayed the campaign, weakening the effort before it began. Joan arrived outside the city in early September 1429 and prepared for battle. Paris was well defended with strong walls and experienced English and Burgundian forces inside. On September 8th, she led an assault on the Porte Saint-Honoré, one of the city's main gates. As always, she carried her banner and fought at the front lines, encouraging the troops with prayers and determination. The fighting was fierce. The defenders poured down arrows and stones. Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, but refused to abandon the field. She continued to direct the battle from behind the lines, calling for another charge. But the attack stalled. With nightfall approaching and casualties rising, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat against Joan's protests. The failed attack on Paris marked a turning point. Joan's reputation remained intact among the common soldiers and citizens, but at court, doubts began to grow. Her influence over royal policy started to wane. Charles, now king, no longer relied on her as he once did. Political interests, fear of provoking further conflict, and distrust of Joan's spiritual authority began to eclipse her earlier triumphs. Yet Joan was undeterred. She continued to lead minor campaigns in the following months, capturing towns like Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier and La Charité, often financing the operations herself with donations from supporters. But the tide was shifting. Her vision of total victory clashed with the king's increasingly cautious stance. Despite her injuries, her dwindling support, and the growing political isolation, Joan remained convinced that her mission was not yet complete. She would not stop until France was free, but in the shadows, betrayal and danger were closing in. In the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc continued her campaign, though her position had grown increasingly precarious. Her successes on the battlefield had not translated into lasting political power. King Charles VII, now more focused on diplomacy than war, offered only lukewarm support. Joan, acting largely on her own initiative, turned her attention to the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. She arrived in May 1430, hoping to defend the city and rally the local population. But the odds were stacked against her. The Burgundians, allies of the English, were closing in with superior numbers. On May 23rd, Joan led a small force in a sortie to challenge the besiegers and disrupt their lines. As the battle unfolded outside the city walls, French forces were pushed back. Joan remained behind to cover the retreat, determined to protect her soldiers. In the chaos, the city gates closed too soon. Joan and a few companions were trapped outside. Surrounded by Burgundian cavalry, she fought until she was pulled from her horse and taken captive. Her capture was a devastating blow, not only for Joan herself, but for the morale of the French people. The girl who had once lifted the siege of Orléans and crowned a king now found herself a prisoner. The Burgundians held Joan for months, treating her more as a political prize than a common captive. She was eventually sold to the English for a large sum, an act that confirmed her status as a threat to their cause. The English viewed her not only as a military adversary, but as a dangerous symbol of resistance and divine legitimacy. Throughout her captivity, Joan attempted escape more than once. In one instance, she jumped from a high tower, injuring herself badly, but surviving. Even in chains, her will remained unbroken. She demanded to be treated as a noble prisoner of war, not as a criminal or heretic. But the English had other plans. They did not intend to hold her indefinitely. They meant to destroy her credibility, her image, and the power she had come to represent. Her trial was already being prepared. Joan's capture at Compiègne marked the beginning of her final, most harrowing chapter. She had risen from obscurity to the heights of power, only to be betrayed, abandoned, and delivered into the hands of her enemies. But her story was far from over. After months in Burgundian custody, Joan of Arc was transferred to English hands and brought to Rouen, the English administrative capital in occupied Normandy. There, beginning in January 1431, she faced a formal ecclesiastical trial, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic, a designation that allowed her captors to strip her of honour and execute her under church law. The trial was orchestrated by the English but carried out by a panel of pro-English French clergy, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon. a staunch opponent of Joan and loyal to the Burgundian cause. Its true goal was not justice, but the destruction of Joan's legacy. By branding her a heretic, the English sought to undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII, whose coronation she had enabled. Joan was held in a secular prison, guarded by male soldiers, a direct violation of church law. She was denied access to legal counsel, threatened with torture, and interrogated repeatedly, often for hours at a time without rest or support. Despite being a 19-year-old peasant girl facing some of the most educated men in France, she defended herself with remarkable intelligence and composure. Over the course of several months, she was questioned about her visions, her clothing, her faith, and her role in the war. The judges focused especially on her claim to divine voices and her habit of wearing men's clothing, an act considered both heretical and unnatural by church standards. Despite their pressure, Joan remained firm in her testimony. She maintained that her voices came from God, that she had acted in obedience to divine command, and that she had always remained faithful to the church. At one point, when asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, she famously responded, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a powerful answer, neither arrogant nor self-condemning, and one that impressed even her inquisitors. But the outcome was never truly in question. Political necessity outweighed truth. Joan was eventually condemned for heresy, based largely on her refusal to renounce her visions and her insistence on wearing male attire, which she had resumed in prison for protection. Her sentence was death. The girl who had once lifted a nation would now be silenced, not by defeat in battle, but by a court of men determined to erase her from history, or so they thought. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen, tied to a wooden stake and burned alive. She was just 19 years old. As the flames rose around her, she reportedly called out the name of Jesus repeatedly and asked for a cross to be held before her eyes. A soldier, moved by her courage, handed her a small wooden cross. Witnesses said she faced death with calm resolve. Her execution was meant to be final, a warning, a silencing of a dangerous symbol. But it had the opposite effect. Instead of being erased, Joan became a martyr. Even English and Burgundian observers were disturbed by the spectacle. Some wept. Others openly questioned whether the church had committed a grave injustice. One of the English clerics present was said to have exclaimed, "We are lost! We have burned a saint!" Over the years that followed, Joan's image only grew stronger. Her unwavering faith, her courage in battle, and her dignified defense at trial became the foundation for a powerful legend. In 1456, 25 years after her death, and following a formal investigation ordered by Pope Calixtus III, Joan's trial was declared invalid. She was officially exonerated, her name cleared of heresy. In the centuries that followed, Joan of Arc became a unifying symbol for France. During times of national crisis, particularly during the French Wars of Religion and later during the Franco-Prussian War, her story was invoked as a beacon of courage, patriotism, and divine mission. Artists, writers, and historians immortalized her life. Her face appeared in stained glass, sculpture, and literature. She was celebrated as both a warrior and a mystic, a simple peasant and a national heroine. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church formally canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The girl who had been condemned by church officials was now one of its most revered figures. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. Today, Joan of Arc remains one of the most iconic figures in world history. Her life defied every expectation. Peasant, prophet, warrior, prisoner, saint. Through faith and conviction, she altered the course of a kingdom. Through fire, she entered legend. And through memory, she lives on. The life of a medieval baker began in darkness. Long before roosters crowed or church bells tolled, bakers were already hard at work. Their day often started around midnight, when most of the town was fast asleep. The quiet streets were cold and still, but inside the bakehouse, flames crackled, flour dust hung in the air, and the rhythm of kneading began. Medieval bread wasn't made on a whim. It required precise timing and a practiced hand. Bakers relied on sourdough starters, carefully nurtured fermenting dough that gave rise and flavour to the loaves. There were no commercial yeasts. Everything was done by feel, smell, and experience. The flour was often coarse, ground at a local mill, and carried its own unique character based on region, season, and grain quality. Some bakers even mixed in bran, barley, or beans to stretch their flour supplies. Water was drawn from wells or public fountains. Everything had to be measured and mixed by hand, often in the dim light of oil lamps or candles. The mixing trough was usually wooden, and the dough had to be kneaded until it reached the right texture, a task that required strength and repetition. In colder months, the dough had to be kept warm with cloths or near the hearth to rise properly. The oven, usually a large domed brick structure, had to be heated long before baking. Bakers would burn bundles of wood inside until the walls radiated enough heat to bake several batches of bread. Ashes were raked out carefully, and the oven floor cleaned with a damp cloth or a wooden peel before the loaves were slid in. By the time the town stirred, merchants setting up stalls, church doors opening for morning mass, the baker's first loaves were already out of the oven. The smell of warm bread filled the air. It was the scent of sustenance, of daily survival. For many in the medieval world, bread was the cornerstone of every meal. But for the baker, it was just the beginning. Deliveries had to be made, customers served, and records kept. And once the ovens cooled and the counters cleared, there was little time to rest, because tomorrow's dough would need mixing before the moon set again. In medieval towns, the baker's work never truly ended. To master the daily grind of medieval baking, a baker needed more than just flour and fire. They relied on a trusted set of tools, each shaped by generations of craftsmanship. The bakehouse itself was often a simple stone or timber-framed structure, but inside, it was a specialized world. Every item had a purpose, and efficiency could mean the difference between profit and punishment. The heart of any bakery was the oven. Typically made of clay or brick, these were dome-shaped and massive, designed to retain heat for hours. Heating the oven wasn't quick. Bundles of wood, often oak or beech, were burned inside until the walls radiated the ideal temperature. Then the ashes were raked out and the bread loaded using a peel, a long-handled wooden paddle that allowed bakers to slide loaves deep into the hot chamber without burning themselves. The kneading trough was another essential item, usually carved from a single block of wood or built from heavy planks. These troughs were wide and low, allowing bakers to lean into their work. The dough was mixed and worked by hand, and larger bakeries sometimes had several troughs going at once to keep up with demand. Measuring tools were primitive, but vital. Most bakers used wooden scoops or hand-carved measures for flour and salt, though consistency varied. Scales were rare, and accuracy was often enforced by local guilds or town officials. Cheating customers by underweighting loaves could lead to heavy fines, or worse. Flour was stored in cloth sacks or wooden barrels, while water was hauled in buckets from wells or streams. Some bakeries also had sieves for removing husks or debris, especially in more prosperous towns where finer bread was expected by wealthier clients. Coarser flours, however, were common for the lower classes. Perhaps the most valuable tool was the baker's hands, calloused, experienced, and trained by years of repetition. They knew when dough was ready, when the oven was hot enough, and when a loaf was just beginning to sing its final crusty notes. Everything had to be cleaned and prepared before the next day. The tools, humble though they seemed, were part of a larger rhythm, a cycle of labour, skill, and heat that transformed raw grain into life-sustaining bread. In the hands of a medieval baker, each tool helped feed a town. In the medieval world, bread was more than food. It was the foundation of every meal and a marker of social class. Nearly everyone ate it daily, but not all bread was created equal. What you ate said a great deal about who you were. The wealthiest citizens, nobles, clergy, and prosperous merchants demanded the finest bread, known as manchet, or white bread. Made from finely sifted wheat flour, this bread was soft, pale, and expensive. Producing it required extra labour, grinding, sifting out bran, and using only the most refined parts of the grain. This labour-intensive process raised its cost, placing it far out of reach for commoners. For townsfolk and tradesmen, ravel or wheaten bread was the standard. Still made from wheat, it was less refined, slightly darker, and more nutritious. It struck a balance between cost and quality, and bakers sold it in greater quantities than manchet. In some towns, regulations dictated that this bread must be sold at a fixed weight and price, preventing bakers from exploiting the hungry. But for the poor, the labourers, peasants, and beggars, there was maslin or black bread, often made from a mix of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else was available. This bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes bitter. In hard times, bakers might even stretch it with beans, peas, or chestnut flour. It was filling, yes, but also a reminder of one's place in society. In monasteries, bread varied depending on the order. Some monks ate simple loaves in keeping with their vows of poverty, while wealthier institutions produced high-quality white bread for guests and ranking clergy. Bread was also used as a social tool. During feasts, wealthy lords would use trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, as plates. After the meal, these were either eaten by servants or given to the poor. Charity was often dispensed in the form of bread, handed out at monastery gates or from noble kitchens. A skilled baker had to understand these divisions. They didn't just bake one type of loaf. They produced multiple varieties daily to meet the needs of the entire town. Bread wasn't just nourishment. It was economy, hierarchy, and identity, baked into every crust. In a world where most people lived on little, bread defined who had more and who survived on less. Being a baker in medieval Europe was not just a matter of skill, it was also a matter of law. Bread was considered so essential to life that its production was heavily regulated by local authorities and trade guilds. For a baker, failing to follow the rules didn't just mean bad business, it could mean public humiliation, loss of livelihood, or even imprisonment. In most towns and cities, guilds controlled the profession. These were associations of craftsmen who regulated quality, training, pricing, and supply. Bakers' guilds established strict standards for the weight, size, and ingredients of bread. These standards weren't optional. They were enforced through regular inspections and harsh penalties. New bakers often had to apprentice for several years before they were allowed to operate their own ovens. Guild membership was both a privilege and a protection. It gave bakers the right to sell in the town market and guaranteed some degree of economic stability. But it also bound them to a system of accountability. If a baker was caught selling underweight loaves or substituting poor ingredients, guild officials could fine them, suspend them, or revoke their right to bake altogether. Beyond the guilds, municipal authorities also monitored bread quality. In England, for instance, the assize of bread and ale, a law dating back to the 13th century, dictated exactly how much bread a customer should receive for a set price, which adjusted with grain costs. Officials known as bread weighers or ale tasters conducted surprise inspections and reported violators. Punishment for breaking bread laws could be dramatic. Some bakers were pilloried, locked into public stocks where they were mocked or pelted with stale bread and rotten food. Others were forced to parade through town with substandard loaves strung around their necks. In extreme cases, a repeat offender could be banned from the trade or exiled from the town altogether. These rules weren't just about fairness, they were about survival. Bread riots were a real threat in times of famine or inflation. Town leaders knew that if people suspected they were being cheated out of their daily bread, unrest could follow. For the medieval baker, then, precision wasn't just a point of pride, it was a legal obligation. Every loaf had to meet the mark, because in the eyes of both the guild and the town, baking was not just a trade, it was a public service. Running a medieval bakehouse wasn't just demanding, it was dangerous. Fire was both a necessity and a constant threat. Ovens had to reach incredibly high temperatures to bake dense loaves, and maintaining that heat meant burning large quantities of wood, often in enclosed spaces made of timber, thatch or stone blackened by years of smoke. Most bakehouses were constructed with a large domed oven built from clay or brick, positioned against an outer wall to allow for airflow and loading. To heat it, bakers lit a roaring fire inside the oven itself. This wasn't a casual campfire. This was an intense blaze meant to superheat thick walls that could radiate warmth for hours. Once the fire had burned long enough, bakers would rake out the embers, clean the hearth with a damp rag or sand-soaked brush, and begin baking. But even a moment's carelessness could lead to catastrophe. Embers could escape, thatched roofs could ignite, and in densely packed towns and cities, a bakehouse fire could spread with terrifying speed. For this reason, many towns required that bakehouses be located on the outskirts or built with specific fire-resistant materials, if the baker could afford them. Bakers also faced health risks. Prolonged exposure to heat and smoke took a toll on the lungs and skin. The heavy lifting of flour sacks and kneading of massive batches of dough wore down the body over time. Burns were common, on arms, hands, and faces, earned while loading and unloading hot loaves with long wooden peels. Some cities had communal bakehouses, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Families would prepare dough at home and bring it to a central oven managed by a professional baker. While this system saved fuel and reduced fire hazards in private homes, it introduced its own risks. Loaves could be burned, stolen, or tampered with. Bakers were held responsible for the integrity of each household's bread, and any negligence could lead to formal complaints. Because bread was such a vital staple, a disrupted bakehouse, whether due to fire, illness, or accident, could ripple across the whole town. It wasn't just the baker who suffered. The entire community felt the loss. Despite these dangers, the bakehouse remained the beating heart of daily life. It was a place of labor, heat, and vital routine, where risk and reward burned side by side with every glowing loaf. While the image of the medieval baker often centers on male guild members and apprentices, women played a critical, if often overlooked, role in the daily production of bread. In many towns and villages, especially outside major cities, women were the primary bakers for both family and community. Their presence in the bakehouse was essential to keeping the ovens hot and the population fed. In rural areas, household baking was typically done by women. They baked for their families using communal ovens or small hearths, and in times of surplus, they might sell loaves at market or from their doorstep. For many women, this side trade in bread offered a rare source of independent income. In cities too, widows of bakers were often permitted to continue their husbands' businesses, sometimes becoming successful bakery owners in their own right. Guilds were usually male-dominated, but not entirely exclusive. In certain regions, especially in parts of Germany and France, female bakers were formally recognized. Women could inherit licenses, run bakeries, and train apprentices, including daughters or nieces. Some even petitioned for full guild rights and won them, though this required navigating legal and social challenges. Women in bakehouses performed the same grueling work as men, mixing dough in massive troughs, hauling water and flour, managing oven temperatures, and selling bread in markets. Many also worked as bread sellers, walking through the streets with baskets balanced on their heads or carts loaded with loaves. These women were often the face of the bakery, dealing directly with customers and managing daily sales. Despite their labor, women were often paid less and received less recognition than their male counterparts. They were more vulnerable to accusations of selling underweight bread or poor quality loaves and faced harsh penalties for infractions. Still, their contribution was essential. especially during times of war or plague when men were absent and communities relied on women to sustain the food supply. Baking also intersected with motherhood and caretaking. A woman who could bake well was seen as capable and respectable, keeping her household fed, preserving traditions, and passing down knowledge. In many families, recipes and baking techniques were handed down from mother to daughter like heirlooms. In every corner of medieval society, from noble kitchens to village ovens, women shaped the world through bread. Though history often left them unnamed, their hands were among the first to touch the dough that would nourish entire towns. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was sacred. Few institutions influenced bread making more than the church, which not only consumed vast quantities of bread, but also shaped its symbolism, regulation, and distribution. In monasteries, cathedrals, and village chapels alike, bread was a symbol of life, sacrifice, and divine presence. At the heart of this connection was the Eucharist, the Christian rite in which bread became the body of Christ. The preparation of this bread, often called the host, was subject to strict guidelines. Only the finest white wheat flour could be used, and it had to be unleavened. In monasteries, specific monks were assigned to this holy duty, baking in silence, often at night, in special ovens. These wafers were stamped with sacred symbols and handled with extreme reverence. But the church's relationship with bread went far beyond ritual. Monasteries were among the largest landowners and food producers in medieval Europe. Many ran their own bakehouses, producing vast amounts of bread for the monks, their workers, and guests. The daily monastic diet typically included multiple servings of bread, paired with cheese, ale, or pottage. For the poor, monasteries also served as lifelines, distributing alms bread to beggars and travellers who waited at the gates. Cathedrals and parish churches frequently received bread donations from local bakers and wealthy patrons. These offerings might be displayed on feast days, distributed to the needy, or used in ceremonial processions. Some towns even had special bread altars, where loaves were blessed and handed out in memory of the dead. The church also played a regulatory role. In some towns, ecclesiastical courts handled disputes between bakers and customers, especially in areas where the local clergy governed commercial life. They helped enforce fair prices and weights, often motivated by the belief that cheating customers of bread was not just dishonest, but sinful. On religious feast days, special breads were baked, rich, spiced loaves shaped into crosses, doves, or other sacred forms. These celebratory breads marked the rhythm of the liturgical year and were often shared in the community to strengthen bonds of faith and fellowship. In the medieval imagination, bread was not only sustenance, it was spiritual nourishment. For the baker, supplying bread to the church meant more than earning money. It meant participating in the sacred economy of life, where dough became divine and the oven echoed with ritual as much as routine. In the medieval world, bread was deeply entwined with power. For rulers, mayors, guildmasters, and kings, controlling the price, supply, and quality of bread was as important as maintaining order. Because bread was the staple food for most of the population, often making up 70% or more of a person's diet, its availability was directly linked to political stability. The most visible way this played out was through price controls. Cities and kingdoms established official rates for bread through laws like the assize of bread and ale in England, which tied the price of a loaf to the current cost of grain. If grain prices rose due to poor harvests, drought, or war, bakers were expected to adjust the size of their loaves, not the price. This meant that during times of scarcity, bakers had to produce smaller loaves for the same price, often cutting into their own profits. But if a baker was caught short-changing customers or selling loaves below the legal weight, the punishment could be harsh. Authorities saw cheating as not just theft, but a betrayal of the public trust. In some towns, bakers were pilloried, forced to stand in public stocks while holding underweight loaves. Others were fined, shamed, or even banned from baking. Bakers were also required to keep detailed records of grain purchases, flour usage, and the number of loaves baked. inspectors could show up unannounced to weigh loaves and examine ovens. In particularly tense times, such as during war or famine, bakers were sometimes placed under military guard to ensure fair distribution. Bread riots were among the most feared expressions of unrest. When bread became scarce or unaffordable, mobs could form quickly. In such cases, bakers might be accused of hoarding flour or favouring the wealthy. Entire shops could be looted and records destroyed. To maintain peace, city officials would sometimes seize grain stocks or subsidise bread to prevent starvation and protest. Because of its centrality to life, bread became a tool of both charity and control. Rulers handed out bread during public celebrations or religious festivals to win favour with the people. In castles, lords ensured their retainers and servants had ample supplies, reinforcing loyalty. And in towns, a steady stream of affordable bread was seen as the mark of good governance. In medieval politics, bread wasn't just food, it was power. And the baker stood at the intersection of hunger and authority. Though rarely named in chronicles or praised in songs, the medieval baker left behind a legacy that shaped the very foundation of everyday life. In a world of castles and cathedrals, kings and knights, it was the humble baker who fed the people. And while their work was done in darkness, before the town ever woke, its impact touched every household. The baker's influence extended beyond the ovens and into the cultural fabric of medieval society. From birth to death, bread accompanied every stage of life. It was present at baptisms, shared during weddings, offered in mourning, and honoured at church altars.